In 1993, television birthed its greatest power couple. Mulder and Scully's chemistry was a cultural obsession built on the promise of absolute intellectual equality. But behind closed doors, that iconic partnership was a deeply traumatizing lie. Every time Gillian Anderson looked into David Duchovny's eyes to deliver their legendary romance, she was doing it while being systematically degraded by her own studio. Stripped of half her paycheck, the network issued a sickening mandate. The female lead must never stand equal to the male lead. She was forced to balance on wooden crates and physically commanded to walk one step behind him at all times. This is the devastating reality behind TV's ultimate soulmates, a system that sold feminism while humiliating its female star. It seems impossible today. But to uncover the anatomy of this betrayal, we have to strip away our modern lenses and step directly into the brutal, male-dominated boardrooms of 1993. Let's be clear about the entertainment industry in the early 1990s. The internet was a niche academic tool, not a global cultural force. Network television was an absolute monolith, and it was entirely dominated by a deeply entrenched boys' club. The prevailing wisdom among the men sitting in the executive boardrooms in Los Angeles was that television was fundamentally a man's game. The lead characters who drove the narrative forward were male. If a woman was present on screen, her role was almost always clearly defined by her relationship to the men around her. She was the supportive wife in a sitcom, the victim needing to be rescued in a procedural drama, or she was pure, unadulterated eye candy designed specifically to keep the 18 to 34-year-old male demographic from changing the channel. Furthermore, science fiction was largely considered a dead, unprofitable genre. Aside from the established Star Trek franchise, networks viewed sci-fi as a risk not worth taking. Into this highly conservative, risk-averse environment walked Chris Carter, a former journalist with an idea for a dark, moody, cinematic television show about the paranormal. He didn't want glossy Hollywood heroes. He envisioned two exiled FBI agents operating out of a forgotten basement, investigating the bizarre, terrifying cases that the rest of the Bureau refused to touch. Carter knew that for a show this strange to survive, the relationship between the two lead agents had to be the absolute unshakable anchor of the entire production. It had to be built on mutual respect, high intellect, and a shared obsessive pursuit of the truth. He did not want a traditional sidekick for his leading man. He wanted a true intellectual equal. He wanted a woman who relied on hard science, logic, and pathology to counter the wild supernatural intuitions of her partner. The executives at the Fox network, an up-and-coming channel desperate for mainstream hits, liked the concept of the show, but they had a radically different, fundamentally cynical vision for the woman who would play Dana Scully. And the casting room became the very first brutal battleground. Finding Fox Mulder was a relatively frictionless process. When David Duchovny walked into the audition room, the network executives breathed a sigh of relief. He possessed an Ivy League pedigree, having studied at Princeton and Yale, and he carried a dry, deadpan wit that perfectly suited the brooding profiler. He was handsome in an unconventional, highly marketable way, and he had a growing resume of memorable, edgy television appearances. The network signed off on him almost immediately. He was exactly what the 1990s Hollywood machine understood and valued. But when Chris Carter presented his choice for Special Agent Dana Scully, the Fox boardroom erupted in absolute resistance. Carter's choice was a 24-year-old unknown stage actress from Chicago named Gillian Anderson. She possessed almost no on-camera television experience. In fact, she had lied about her age to get into the audition room, claiming she was 27 because she knew no network would believe a 24-year-old was a seasoned medical doctor and FBI Academy instructor. Gillian Anderson was not a product of the Los Angeles star-making machine. She had a rebellious punk rock background and a fierce dedication to theater. When she read the lines for Scully, she was intense, dead serious, and projected a formidable intelligence. Chris Carter later stated that when Anderson spoke the complex medical jargon required for the script, she didn't sound like an actress playing dress-up in a lab coat. She sounded like a woman who actually understood the science she was quoting. The network executives did not care about her intelligence. They actively hated her look. In the brutal, degrading vernacular of 1990s television executives, they considered the young Gillian Anderson to be dowdy. She was not a classic Hollywood blonde. She wore oversized suits. Her hair was unstyled, and she lacked the polished, highly manufactured glamour that networks demanded of their female leads. She was too sharp, too serious, and, in their blunt estimation, entirely unsexy. The Fox executives were not shy about telling Chris Carter exactly what they wanted. According to multiple sources involved in the early days of production, the network brass demanded a bombshell. They explicitly pointed to Pamela Anderson, who was currently the reigning queen of television sex appeal, running in slow motion on the massive hit Baywatch. They told Carter they needed a busty, tall, blonde actress who could wear tight clothes and provide visual stimulation for the male audience. They firmly believed that a weird, dark show about aliens and government conspiracies would only survive if it offered a traditional, easily digestible pinup girl. They wanted a woman who would look good standing next to David Duchovny, not a woman who could verbally outmaneuver him. Chris Carter refused to yield. He staked his entire professional reputation on this unknown theater actress from Chicago. He fought a bitter, prolonged, and highly contentious battle with his own network, flatly refusing to cast the leggy blonde they demanded. He argued fiercely that the entire premise of The X-Files relied completely on the grounded, believable reality of Dana Scully. She was the audience's tether to the real world. If you cast a Baywatch lifeguard as a forensic pathologist with degrees in physics, the audience would immediately reject the premise, and the show would become a laughingstock. The standoff lasted for weeks. The network tested other, more traditionally glamorous actresses, but none of them possessed the necessary gravity to deliver the dialogue. Finally backed into a corner and panicked that the pilot episode would not shoot on schedule, the Fox executives caved. They begrudgingly allowed Chris Carter to hire Gillian Anderson, but their approval was not an admission of defeat. It was an angry, resentful concession. The executives felt they had been bullied by their showrunner into accepting an unmarketable, undesirable female lead. They believed she would sink the show. They decided that if they could not have the submissive, glamorous actress they originally wanted, they would actively force the intelligent, serious actress. They had to know her place. The network boardroom made a silent, unified decision to punish the unknown 24-year-old. They could not fire her, but they could absolutely control how she was perceived by the American public. They immediately began drafting the rules of engagement that would systematically strip her of her visual authority and her financial equality, setting the stage for one of the most insidious displays of institutional sexism in modern television history. When the ink finally dried on her contract, Gillian Anderson packed her bags and relocated to the damp, heavily forested landscape of Vancouver, British Columbia, where the pilot and subsequent early seasons of The X-Files were to be filmed. She was 24 years old, holding the script for a character that would eventually define her life, and she was stepping onto a massive network production set for the very first time. She believed that because she had won the role of Dana Scully, the battle was over. She assumed that she and David Duchovny were about to embark on a collaborative, equal partnership to bring Chris Carter's dark, moody vision to life. She was entirely unaware that the network executives back in Los Angeles, still bitter over being forced to hire an actress they deemed unsexy and dowdy, had already initiated a covert, deeply insidious campaign to undermine her authority. They could not rewrite the dialogue to make Dana Scully stupid. Chris Carter protected the scripts fiercely, but they controlled a far more powerful tool. They controlled the visual language of the show. To fully grasp the sheer cruelty of what the Fox network did to Gillian Anderson, you have to understand how television and film communicate with the human brain. Television is a primarily visual medium. Long before a character speaks a single line of dialogue, the audience has already processed a massive amount of information about them based entirely on how the camera frames them. The way a director uses blocking, the precise physical choreography of actors within a scene, subliminally dictates the power dynamics to the viewer. The person who stands in the center of the frame, the person who initiates movement, and the person who walks in front is instantly recognized by the human subconscious as the leader. The person who follows behind is instantly categorized as the subordinate. The Fox network understood this psychological reality perfectly, and they decided to weaponize the camera against their own leading lady. When production began in 1993, a strict non-negotiable directive was handed down from the network brass to the rotating roster of directors hired to shoot the episodes. It was a physical rule of engagement for filming the two FBI agents. In any dynamic scene where Fox Mulder and Dana Scully were moving, Gillian Anderson was strictly forbidden from walking directly beside David Duchovny. She was contractually and directionally obligated to stay exactly one step behind him. Think about the iconic visual staples of The X-Files. Think about the agents marching down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways of the J. Edgar Hoover building. Think about them bursting through the doors of a suspect's house, or navigating the eerie, fog-drenched woods of the Pacific Northwest with their heavy mag lights piercing the darkness. In almost every single one of those moving shots during the early seasons, Gillian Anderson is trailing a pace or two behind her male co-star. This was not a casual accident, nor was it a natural consequence of the actor's walking speeds. It was a meticulously enforced choreography. If an enthusiastic director came onto the set and tried to block a scene where Mulder and Scully walked shoulder to shoulder to emphasize their equal partnership, the network notes would immediately strike it down. If Anderson accidentally matched Duchovny's stride during a long tracking shot, the take was considered ruined. The director would call cut. The actors would be reset to their starting marks, and Anderson would be reminded to fall back into her designated place. The psychological tactic behind this mandate was brilliant in its malice. On the surface, Fox eagerly marketed The X-Files as a progressive drama featuring a brilliant female scientist, but the camera quietly betrayed that narrative. By legally forcing Anderson to trail a pace behind Duchovny, the cinematography subliminally reduced her to a traditional female sidekick. The script told viewers they were equals. The camera ensured she remained perpetually in his shadow. Fox Mulder is the spearhead. He is the hero, the initiator, the alpha who opens the doors and clears the path. Dana Scully is the assistant. She is the reactor, following safely in his wake, waiting for his cues. The network used the cinematography to actively undermine the feminism of the script, ensuring that the female lead they never wanted was perpetually kept in the visual shadow of the leading man. When pressed on this bizarre blocking rule, the studio and the production team had a very convenient, highly practical excuse ready to deploy. They blamed the physical reality of human biology. David Duchovny is roughly 6 feet tall. Gillian Anderson stands at approximately 5'3". A 9-inch height difference between two leading actors who share almost all of their screen time presents a genuine logistical challenge for a camera crew. If a 6-foot man and a 5'3" woman stand face to face for a serious, intimate conversation, it is incredibly difficult to frame a standard two-shot without one of them looking absurd. Either the camera is tilted drastically upward, making the man look like a giant, or it is tilted downward, diminishing the woman. The film industry's standard solution for this height discrepancy has existed for decades. It is a piece of equipment known as an apple box. These are sturdy wooden crates built in varying standardized sizes, full, half, quarter, and pancakes. They are placed on the floor just out of the camera's view, allowing shorter actors to step up and artificially increase their height. On the Vancouver sets of The X-Files, these wooden crates were so ubiquitous that the crew affectionately dubbed them the Jilly boards or Jilly boxes. For Gillian Anderson, the physical reality of shooting a massive network drama was uniquely grueling. The production schedule for a 24-episode season of television in the 1990s was notoriously punishing. The cast and crew routinely worked 14 to 16-hour days, often shooting late into the night in the freezing rain and mud of Canadian forests. And for a massive percentage of those grueling 16-hour days, Gillian Anderson was required to act, hit her emotional marks, and deliver complex polysyllabic medical dialogue while physically balancing on a wooden crate. In later interviews, Anderson spoke candidly about the bizarre physical disconnect of acting while balancing on wooden crates. Standing on an apple box for a static close-up is standard Hollywood practice, but the true, humiliating cruelty of the network's mandate was revealed in the stark contrast between how they treated her when she was standing still versus how she was treated the moment the scene required dynamic action. When Mulder and Scully were stationary, standing over a corpse in a morgue, or debating a case file in Mulder's office, the crew went to enormous lengths to equalize them. They built small ramps, laid down tracks of half-apple boxes, and propped Anderson up so she could look Duchovny squarely in the eye. They proved that they could make them look like visual equals if they wanted to. But the absolute moment the scene required dynamic action, the moment the characters needed to walk, run, or actively investigate a space, the wooden boxes were kicked away, the ramps were abandoned, and the studio mandate was ruthlessly enforced. She was immediately ordered to the back. The studio weaponized her natural physical height as a convenient excuse to demote her visual importance. They claimed it was simply too difficult to build walking tracks for her to match Duchovny's stride, or to use forced perspective camera angles to make them appear equal while in motion. But the reality is that major television productions solve far more complex logistical problems every single day. They chose not to solve this one because the visual demotion served their corporate bias. This cruel contrast didn't just affect the framing of the television screen. It deeply affected Anderson's physical performance as an actor. Walking behind someone naturally dictates a reactive, submissive physical energy. When you are a step behind, your eye line is obstructed by the person in front of you. You are literally following their lead, matching their pace, and waiting for them to react to the environment before you can. It forced Anderson into a submissive physical posture that directly contradicted the authority of her character. She had to expend an enormous amount of artistic energy constantly fighting against the physical reality of her blocking, trying to project the formidable intellect and agency of Dana Scully while being treated like a junior tag-along by the camera crew. She endured this relentless visual subjugation for years. She was the co-lead of what was rapidly becoming the biggest, most culturally significant television show on the planet. Yet on the actual sound stages, she was treated like a subordinate who hadn't earned the right to walk shoulder to shoulder with the captain. By the time The X-Files entered its second and third seasons, the landscape of global pop culture had completely shifted. Chris Carter's strange, moody show about paranormal investigators was no longer a cult curiosity struggling for survival on Friday nights. It had exploded into an international television phenomenon. The ratings were astronomical. The merchandise was flying off the shelves. The phrase, "the truth is out there," had become a defining mantra of the 1990s. At the very center of this massive cultural hurricane was Gillian Anderson. The unknown theater actress from Chicago had transformed Dana Scully into a global icon. The Scully effect was already taking root across the world, with universities reporting a sudden massive surge in young women enrolling in STEM programs, directly inspired by the brilliant, rational forensic pathologists they saw on their screens. Yet, while millions of women were looking up to Dana Scully as the ultimate symbol of modern professional equality, the woman playing her was being subjected to one of the most egregious, systematic acts of wage theft in television history. The physical reality of shooting The X-Files in the mid-1990s was notoriously brutal. The production filmed in Vancouver, British Columbia, utilizing the dense, damp forests and perpetually overcast skies to create the show's signature gloomy aesthetic. For the cast and crew, this meant enduring 10 months of the year working in freezing rain, knee-deep mud, and bitter cold. The schedules were relentless. They routinely worked 14 to 16-hour days, often shooting complex scenes at 3 in the morning in the middle of a freezing forest. Gillian Anderson was in the trenches for every single minute of it. She worked the exact same grueling hours as David Duchovny. She suffered through the exact same freezing rain. Their screen time was virtually identical. There was no X-Files without the dynamic between the two agents. They were the twin pillars supporting a multi-million-dollar corporate structure. Furthermore, any honest assessment of the scripts reveals that the burden of the dialogue often fell far more heavily on Anderson's shoulders. As the believer, Fox Mulder was frequently assigned the snappy, memorable one-liners. He got to look at a bizarre crime scene and simply say, "It was aliens." Dana Scully, however, was the medical doctor and the hard scientist. Anderson was the actor explicitly charged with delivering the dense, complex, jargon-heavy exposition that grounded the show's wild premise in reality. She had to memorize intricate paragraphs of forensic pathology, explaining the biological mechanics of a fibrous extraterrestrial virus, or the decomposition rate of a mutated corpse, using polysyllabic medical terminology. More importantly, she had to deliver those lines rapidly and naturally, making the audience believe she possessed a decade of medical training. It was incredibly difficult, highly technical acting that required massive amounts of preparation outside of filming hours. To compound the immense pressure, Anderson became pregnant during the show's first season and gave birth to her daughter Piper early in the second season. She worked through the physical exhaustion of pregnancy on a hostile, physically demanding set, taking only a minuscule amount of time off for the birth before rushing back to the grueling production schedule because the network demanded it. She proved her absolute uncompromising dedication to the job under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. She was doing equal work. In many ways, regarding the technical dialogue and physical endurance, she was doing harder work. Yet for the first 3 years of this global phenomenon, the Fox network paid Gillian Anderson exactly half of David Duchovny's salary, 50%. When this financial reality was exposed, the studio executives had a highly polished, standard Hollywood excuse ready to deploy. They argued that the pay disparity had absolutely nothing to do with her gender. They claimed it was a simple matter of name recognition and market value. When the show was cast in 1993, David Duchovny possessed a slightly more robust resume. He had played the lead in the erotic anthology series Red Shoe Diaries on premium cable, and he had delivered a memorable cult favorite performance as a DEA agent in Twin Peaks. Gillian Anderson, by contrast, was a complete unknown. The network argued that they were simply paying Duchovny a premium for the established audience he supposedly brought to the pilot episode. In the ruthless, transactional logic of Hollywood deal-making, this argument might have held a tiny shred of validity during the first few episodes of Season 1. It is standard practice to pay established actors more than newcomers. But by the end of the first season, that excuse had entirely evaporated. The X-Files was not a hit because of Red Shoe Diaries. It was a hit because of Mulder and Scully. By Season 2, they were both universally recognized household names. They were sharing the covers of Rolling Stone and Entertainment Weekly. They were equally responsible for the massive, unprecedented cash flow pouring into the Fox network's bank accounts. Despite the show's massive success, the network stubbornly refused to correct the pay gap. They allowed Anderson to continue working 16-hour days, memorizing medical jargon, and balancing on wooden apple boxes, fully aware that they were valuing her labor at precisely half the worth of the man standing next to her. They were actively, consciously exploiting her. They knew she was essential to the show's survival. If Scully left, the franchise would instantly collapse. But they relied on the assumption that she was too young, too grateful for the opportunity, and too intimidated by the Hollywood machine to fight back. They drastically underestimated the woman they had hired. Gillian Anderson stewed over this profound injustice for 3 years. She endured the grueling schedule, the subliminal sexism of the camera blocking, and the financial disrespect while she quietly built her leverage. She watched the ratings climb. She watched the syndication deals close for record-breaking amounts. She knew exactly how much money her face and her performance were generating for the executives who had originally deemed her dowdy and unwanted. By the third season, the cultural and critical consensus had firmly solidified. The industry could no longer deny her talent. In a massive blow to the network's original assessment of her worth, Anderson began sweeping the major acting awards. She won the Screen Actors Guild Award. She won the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Television Drama Series. She secured the Emmy Award. She was achieving a level of critical prestige that the network desperately craved. The excuse that she was a junior partner was officially dead. She possessed the awards, she possessed the cultural impact, and most importantly, She possessed the undeniable leverage of an irreplaceable lead on a hit show. Anderson and her legal team finally drew a hard line in the sand. They went to the Fox boardroom and issued a clear, uncompromising ultimatum. She demanded absolute financial parity. She demanded to be paid the exact same amount as her male co-star, retroactive to her new contract. The unspoken threat hanging in the air was absolute. If the network refused to pay her what she was worth, Dana Scully would walk away, and the multi-billion-dollar X-Files franchise would burn to the ground. It was a high-stakes game of corporate poker. The Fox executives blustered and stalled. They hated giving up leverage, and they deeply resented being cornered by the actress they had fought so hard not to hire in the first place. But they were trapped by their own success. They ran the numbers and realized the catastrophic financial loss they would suffer if production shut down. They could not recast Scully. The audience backlash would be apocalyptic. The network finally blinked. After 3 years of systemic institutional wage theft, Fox executives capitulated. They agreed to close the massive pay gap, finally elevating Gillian Anderson's salary to match David Duchovny's. She had taken on a major American television network and won. But Anderson did not just stop at the financial victory. She understood that true equality was not just about the numbers on a paycheck. It was about how she was presented to the world. During these intense contract negotiations, she specifically targeted the humiliating visual mandates that had governed her movements for 3 years. She demanded the permanent abolition of the one-step-behind rule. She argued that if she was being paid as an equal, and if the narrative demanded they were equals, then she had earned the absolute right to be framed as an equal by the camera. The network, having already conceded the financial war, surrendered on the visual front as well. The directive was lifted. The directors were permitted to block the scenes naturally. When you watch the later seasons of The X-Files, you can actually see the exact moment this victory takes effect. The physical dynamic shifts. Scully no longer trails in Mulder's wake. When they walk down the hallways of the FBI, they walk shoulder to shoulder. They enter rooms simultaneously. The visual hierarchy was finally dismantled. Gillian Anderson had fought a grueling multi-year war behind the scenes to force the Hollywood machine to grant her the basic professional dignity she had deserved since day one. If the story of Gillian Anderson and the Fox network had ended in the late 1990s, it would be remembered as a tidy, triumphant narrative of a determined young woman overcoming the systemic sexism of a bygone era. She had fought the boardroom, she had secured equal pay, and she had literally stepped out of the physical shadow of her male co-star to walk beside him as a true equal. When The X-Files finally concluded its original monumental 9-season run in 2002, the characters of Mulder and Scully were permanently etched into the Mount Rushmore of television history. Anderson walked away from the Los Angeles studio system believing that the brutal battles of her 20s had finally established a permanent, undeniable precedent for her worth. She assumed the war was over. She was tragically mistaken. To understand the sheer, breathtaking audacity of what the Hollywood machine attempted to do to her next, we must trace her steps in the years following the original series. After hanging up her FBI badge, Gillian Anderson did not fade into the background, nor did she coast on the syndication royalties of her 90s fame. Instead, she deliberately walked away from the American blockbuster machine and relocated to the United Kingdom, embarking on one of the most remarkable, critically acclaimed second acts in modern acting history. Over the next 14 years, Anderson completely reinvented herself. She shed the American television persona and attacked the prestigious, demanding world of British theater and prestige drama. She delivered titanic, award-winning performances on the London stage, earning critical reverence for her portrayal of Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire. On television, she proved her astonishing range by taking on heavy, complex literary adaptations, most notably her BAFTA-nominated performance as Lady Dedlock in the BBC's Bleak House, and her haunting turn as Miss Havisham in Great Expectations. Crucially, she also returned to the crime thriller genre, but strictly on her own terms. She starred as the terrifyingly cold, brilliantly complex detective superintendent Stella Gibson in the critically acclaimed BBC series The Fall, and played the manipulative psychotherapist Dr. Bedelia du Maurier in NBC's Hannibal. By 2015, the cultural and professional landscape had completely shifted. Gillian Anderson was no longer a 24-year-old unknown actress fighting for scraps of respect. She was a globally revered Emmy, Golden Globe, and Olivier award-winning heavyweight. She was a woman in her late 40s at the absolute undeniable peak of her artistic powers. Furthermore, it could easily be argued that in terms of current critical prestige and global relevance, her star shone even brighter than that of David Duchovny, who had enjoyed a successful but quieter television run with his comedy drama Californication. Meanwhile, the television industry was undergoing a massive transformation. The era of streaming had arrived, and networks were desperately mining their intellectual property libraries for guaranteed hits. Nostalgia was the new currency. Fox, looking to capitalize on the massive built-in global fan base of their greatest triumph, announced that The X-Files would return to television as a special event revival series in 2016. The announcement sent shockwaves of excitement across the internet. It was a guaranteed multi-million-dollar moneymaker. The network approached Chris Carter, David Duchovny, and Gillian Anderson to reprise their iconic roles. The scripts were drafted, the production schedules were locked, and the highly anticipated return to Vancouver was set in motion. Then, the official contracts arrived at the offices of Anderson's representatives. Her legal team opened the offer from the Fox network. They looked at the compensation figure printed on the page for her return as Dana Scully. The network offered her exactly half of David Duchovny's salary. Again, despite decades of global acclaim, the awards, and being the co-equal anchor of a multi-billion-dollar franchise, the boardroom executives still inherently viewed her as a discounted asset. They arrogantly attempted to execute the exact same institutional wage theft they had pulled on the unknown 24-year-old back in 1993. The shock of this offer cannot be overstated. In the 1990s, the network had hidden behind the flimsy, highly debatable excuse of name recognition and market value to justify paying her less. But in 2015, that excuse was completely unequivocally dead. There was no metric on earth by which David Duchovny was twice as valuable to the X-Files as Gillian Anderson. You cannot revive the franchise without Scully. She was not a supporting character, she was the co-lead. This offer was not a simple clerical error or a tough opening negotiation tactic. It was naked, institutionalized misogyny. The network executives issued the 50% offer because that is how the deep underlying machinery of Hollywood operates by default. The system is programmed to exploit female labor. The executives simply assumed they could get away with it because historically the system always protects the men at the top of the call sheet. They assumed she would quietly accept the insult for the sake of the fans and the revival. This time, however, Gillian Anderson did not suffer in silence. She did not spend 3 years working 16-hour days while quietly negotiating behind closed doors. She was a veteran of this specific war, and she knew exactly how to fight back. She immediately took the battle out of the boardroom and dropped it directly into the court of public opinion. In early 2016, as the press tour for the revival began, journalists began asking standard, fluffy questions about what it felt like to be back on set. Anderson seized the opportunity to detonate a public relations bomb. She revealed the insulting 50% pay offer to The Hollywood Reporter and The Daily Beast. She refused to protect the network that was trying to rob her. It was shocking to me, given all the work that I had done in the past, to get us to be paid fairly, she told the press, her frustration palpable. I worked really hard toward that and finally got somewhere with it. Even in interviews in the last few years, people have said to me, "Well, we can't believe that happened. How did you feel about it? That is insane." And my response always was, that was then, this is now. And then it happened again. I don't even know what to say about it. It is sad. By publicly stating, that was then, this is now, and then it happened again, Anderson perfectly articulated the deepest, most discouraging fear of every woman fighting for equality in the workplace. The fear that no matter how much you prove your worth, the system will always reset to default the moment you turn your back. The public outcry was immediate, massive, and entirely hostile toward the Fox network. The internet erupted in a firestorm of criticism. Fans, cultural critics, and fellow actors publicly shamed the studio for its blatant, archaic sexism. The timing was disastrous for Fox. The cultural conversation around the gender pay gap in Hollywood was reaching a boiling point, and the network had just handed the public the most egregious, indefensible example of it. Humiliated and facing a massive public relations disaster that threatened to derail the highly lucrative revival before it even aired, the network executives were forced to backtrack with dizzying speed. Within days of Anderson's public exposure of the contract, the studio rushed to amend the offer. By the time the cameras finally rolled in Vancouver for the 2016 revival, Anderson had secured absolute equal pay once again. She won the battle, but the psychological damage of the 2016 contract offer left a permanent, bitter scar. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that nothing in the deep structural machinery of Hollywood had actually evolved. The industry had not learned a moral lesson in the 1990s. It had simply learned to hide its bias slightly better. The executives did not pay her equally in 2016 because they finally respected her worth as an artist. They paid her equally because she caught them red-handed, humiliated them in the global press, and forced them to open their checkbooks. The 2016 revival of The X-Files was a monumental commercial success for the Fox network, breaking viewership records and proving that the global appetite for Mulder and Scully was as ravenous as ever. Gillian Anderson had successfully humiliated the studio and the press, forced their hand, and secured the equal pay she had rightfully earned. But as the dust settled on the 11th and final season in 2018, the atmosphere surrounding her participation had fundamentally changed. The victory was secured, but the trust was permanently, irreparably broken. The profound tragedy of the 2016 contract dispute was the exhausting realization that the architecture of Hollywood had remained completely frozen in time. The men in the boardroom had not evolved. They had only yielded because they were caught. For Anderson, the reality of returning to the Vancouver sound stages was no longer a joyous homecoming. It was a return to an active, hostile battleground where she constantly had to check her flanks for institutional sabotage. And the sabotage, she soon discovered, was not limited to the accounting department. It was baked into the very creative DNA of the revival. As production geared up for the 11th season, the entertainment industry was experiencing a massive seismic reckoning. The hashtag #MeToo and Time's Up movements were actively dismantling the long-held protections of predatory men in Hollywood, and a fierce, overdue spotlight was finally being shown on the lack of female representation behind the camera. Against this cultural backdrop, an investigative entertainment piece published the roster of writers and directors hired by Chris Carter to helm the new season of The X-Files. The list was entirely male. Despite the show being anchored by one of the most famous, complex, and beloved female characters in television history, the network and the showrunner had not hired a single woman to write or direct the core episodes of the revival. Gillian Anderson, having just fought a brutal public war over her paycheck, refused to let this creative inequity slide in silence. She took to Twitter, sharing the article with her millions of followers, and added a devastating historical footnote. She pointed out that across the original 207 episodes of The X-Files, only 2 had been directed by women. Furthermore, she herself had to fight tooth and nail just to be allowed to write and direct a single episode during the show's original run. "I look forward to the day when the numbers are different," she wrote, publicly calling out the systemic exclusion of women from the creative process of her own show. This public rebuke was the final, definitive turning point. Anderson realized that, while she had forced the network to respect her financially, she could not force the deeply entrenched boys' club to change its fundamental culture. The men running the X-Files still viewed the world through an exclusively male lens, assuming they were perfectly equipped to write the internal life of a female icon without actually employing any women to do it. The show that had masqueraded as a beacon of progressive feminist storytelling was, behind the curtain, operating as an exclusionary patriarchy. Anderson had spent 25 years fighting this exact machine. She had balanced on the humiliating wooden apple boxes. She had fought the one-step-behind camera mandate. She had already fought the battle for equal pay in the 90s, only to face the exact same insult 2 decades later. She had spent her entire adult life demanding that a multi-billion-dollar corporation grant her the basic professional dignity of an equal partner. She was exhausted, and more importantly, she was done. Before the 11th season even finished airing in 2018, Gillian Anderson made a shocking unilateral announcement that sent the Fox network into a total tailspin. She publicly declared that she was leaving the X-Files forever. She would not return for a 12th season. She would not return for another movie. She was hanging up Dana Scully's FBI badge for good. The network executives and Chris Carter were completely blindsided. Carter gave interviews stating that the X-Files was Mulder and Scully and that he could not imagine doing the show without her. The network scrambled, desperate to keep their lucrative intellectual property alive. They had assumed she would stay indefinitely, lured by the massive paychecks she had finally secured. But they fundamentally misunderstood the woman they had been dealing with for a quarter of a century. Gillian Anderson's ultimate display of power was not securing the equal paycheck. It was the absolute uncompromising willingness to walk away from it. She did not need Fox. She had built a vast, highly acclaimed career in the United Kingdom. She was preparing to take on the role of Jean Milburn in the massive Netflix hit Sex Education, and she was gearing up to deliver a terrifyingly precise Emmy-winning performance as Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in The Crown. She was a global powerhouse who could write her own ticket anywhere in the world. She walked away from the American network system on her own terms, leaving the executives holding a dead franchise that they could not resurrect without her. When we evaluate the historical significance of this behind-the-scenes war, it becomes clear that there are two distinct legacies at play: the legacy of Dana Scully and the legacy of Gillian Anderson. The legacy of Dana Scully is undeniable. The character is a genuine cultural touchstone. The Scully effect was a real, measurable sociological phenomenon. She proved to a generation of viewers that a woman on television did not have to be a helpless victim, a glamorous sidekick, or a two-dimensional punchline. She could be the smartest person in the room. She could rely on logic, hard science, and an unshakable moral compass to navigate a terrifying world. Scully fought shadowy, cigar-smoking men in dimly lit rooms, exposing government conspiracies and demanding the truth. But the legacy of Gillian Anderson is arguably far more important, because her war was not fought in the realm of science fiction. It was fought in the real world against the very real, very powerful corporate structures that dictate the terms of modern labor. Anderson fought her own shadowy, cigar-smoking men in the executive boardrooms of Los Angeles. She exposed the corporate conspiracy of institutional wage theft. She dragged the deeply sexist, humiliating camera mandates into the harsh light of public scrutiny. She taught a generation of women that it is not enough to simply be the smartest person in the room. You must actively, fiercely demand to be compensated for your intelligence. You must refuse to balance on the wooden boxes they build to keep you quiet, and you must refuse to walk a single step behind a man who is doing the exact same job. The story of Gillian Anderson and the X-Files is a masterclass in the ugly, unvarnished reality of the entertainment industry. It is absolute proof that the Hollywood machine does not inherently desire equality. It is a system built to exploit labor, to minimize the value of women, and to prioritize the comfort and authority of men. It will only concede ground when it is violently forced to do so by individuals who refuse to be subjugated. For decades, the Fox network sold the American public a television show about the relentless, uncompromising search for the truth. Yet, the ultimate tragic irony of the franchise is that the executives who profited from that show spent 25 years desperately trying to hide the truth of their own profound misogyny. They hired a brilliant 24-year-old stage actress and immediately tried to force her into a submissive, discounted role. They weaponized the camera to diminish her visual authority. They stole half her salary, and they arrogantly assumed she would be too grateful for the exposure to fight back. But the system picked the wrong woman. Gillian Anderson did not just play a hero on television, she became one behind the scenes. She took the blows, she learned the mechanics of the machine, and she ultimately bent a multi-billion-dollar corporation to her will. She started her journey on a damp sound stage, contractually forced to walk in the shadow of her male co-star. But she ended her journey by bringing the entire franchise to a halt, walking away on her own terms, and leaving the men who tried to control her entirely in the dark.